Several years ago, I was with one of my boys and we had gone to meet with a counselor. And she was using this analogy that was just extremely helpful. She had in her hands an imaginary balloon. And she said, imagine if you just keep blowing this balloon up. You keep blowing and you put more stuff in it, and more wind and more pressure. She said, that's what's going on with you. That's what's going on with your son. He is at his stress limit. Your wife is clearly above hers. And if you keep putting air into this balloon, at some point, one of three unhealthy things are going to happen, and they happen to people all the time. So she said, option number one is this. Option number one is some people just explode. You put enough pressure into that balloon, it just explodes, and it comes out in the form of this angry outburst. Too much pressure, the balloon explodes. Too much pressure, people explode. The result is a lot of times they feel like they've dealt with the real issue, but they haven't. It's just a temporary explosion. This is why guys a lot of times just yell and get angry, and then we feel like I got that off my chest. Well, you still have to deal with the deeper issue. In fact, in the anger and in the outburst, you might have scared a lot of people. You might have caused a lot of other emotional clutter for others that now you got to deal with. Option number two is this. You can let that balloon get full and then let out some air just by squeezing the top. Like you don't want to let a lot of stuff out, so you just let a little bit out, and it causes this shriek, this shrill, this nerve-wracking grinding, like bringing your fingers down on a chalkboard type of. The result is you control everyone with your temperament, setting them constantly on edge. Why? Because there's too much stuff, too much air in the balloon, and some of it's leaking out, it's shrieling, it's screaking. A lot of people do that. That's unhealthy. Another way that you can deal with things when they're unhealthy and hard is you just let go of the balloon and it just blows off. Immediately, the air leaves, it just flies off and it disappears. Now, the result of this is kinder than an angry outburst, but it has a similar result. You think that you dealt with it because you've hidden, you've escaped, but really, you haven't. And people do these three scenarios all of the time. Why? Because life is beautiful and life is hard. And so often, because we're undiagnosed, which is going to be most of us, we don't have a healthy way to deal with it. So we choose one of those three. The healthy option would actually be to realize, hey, this balloon is getting too full. I need to gradually let some space out. I don't need to push to the limits. I need to invite in some margin. I need space to flex. I need space to weather increased pressure. So when increased pressure comes, I don't fall into the unhealthy three alternatives. Now, again, because it's undiagnosable struggle, a lot of us don't ever face this issue. We just go through life unaware that we're exploding, go through life unaware that we're shrieking, shrilling. We go on unaware that we're kind of blowing off. And part of that is twofold. Number one, ignorance. We just don't know. And part of it is sometimes we're afraid to face reality. A couple years ago, I met with a counselor. I was invited in by my wife, and the counselor said, "How are you feeling today?" And I told her, I said, "Okay." And she looked at me and said, "Okay is not one. How are you feeling?" And I said, I don't know. I'm doing all right." And she said, "Well, I don't know. I'm all right." Like that's not one either. How are you feeling today? And by that time, I'm like thinking, okay, I'm really perturbed is how I'm feeling now. I'm frustrated is how I feel. I didn't tell her that. I just kind of keeping my cool, like going like, what does she mean? How am I feeling? And then she handed me this card, very similar to what I'll show you on the screen right there. And all these different feelings were grouped and sorted together, kind of clustered based on similarities. And when I looked through that, I realized that I had felt a lot of those things before in my life, not all of them, but I never had language for it. And by looking and seeing, oh goodness, there's one. Oh, there's one, there's another. By suddenly having language for it, it gave me labels to kind of sort how I was feeling in the moment. Here's my point. I wasn't only afraid of facing how I was feeling, especially when it was, quote, a negative feeling. I was afraid of facing negative feelings, and I was just kind of ignorant to the whole idea of emotional health because I was unsure about feelings in general. That leads us to point number 3. Point number 3 is we won't progress as a person beyond our ability to deal with the hard. Because at some point, we're all going to struggle. And at some point, for the vast majority of us, it's going to be undiagnosable. Now, back in my story, when I grew up in the church, I remember that they had this little tract. A tract is a brochure that's designed to tell people about Jesus. And inside the tract, it had a picture of this train right here. I literally pulled this graphic from that tract, the Jesus brochure. And it was labeled fact, faith, feeling. And the author of the brochure said something like this: our engine is the facts. The facts are what are important. And on some days, you rely on the facts and the data. You won't always feel saved, is what he was saying, because the feelings are just the caboose. The feelings are at the end, and the feelings aren't really important. Now, in my little kid mind, I thought, well, yeah, some days you feel great, some days not so much so. Yeah, that makes sense. Facts are important. I don't think the author was intending to make the argument that you could take or leave the caboose. I mean, I see trains driving around through my neighborhood all the time without a caboose. But in some sense, I think that's where we've taken things. We need the facts. The facts are important to any area of life. Faith, I don't know, but feelings, and as a result, we ignore the feelings, but you can't ignore them. Like, you still live out of those feelings, especially when you try to bury or hide or are ignorant of them. In other words, the best thing that you can do is to be self-aware of them. The author, Peter Scazzero, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he said, we all have all of these parts of us, and all the parts of the whole matter. We have social parts of us. We have a spiritual part of us. We have a physical part. We have an intellectual part of us. And we have an emotional component that's important. He says that the issue is, so often when we struggle in any of these other areas, when we struggle in any of those areas, it is easy to notice and easy to see. It says, for instance, if somebody physically has an unhealth, if they've broken their arm, they wear a cast, and it shows us that, hey, they've got something they need to deal with. If they come in a wheelchair, we know, hey, there's something physical. And generally, when we see somebody that has some kind of physical unhealth going on, we make concessions and we go out of our way to help them. We do the same thing with spiritual issues and spiritual concerns. People who have spiritual hurts and pains and questions, they generally ask questions and they seek the help of pastors, or they ask and make comments in Bible studies or at church, and we help people in that area. Intellectually, we know that if someone has Alzheimer's or Tourette's syndrome or some intellectual struggle, maybe the IQ, they just can't put things together as other people. Like, we go out of our way and help. The same is true in social and relational settings. You probably have one awkward family member that says things inappropriately, and you know, hey, let's just kind of make concessions and work around that. You see, all these other issues, sometimes when we have a weak area, they're obvious, we can't hide them, and so we own them. The problem is so often emotional things. They are not obvious for a season, or we can cover them up, or we can spin it and say somehow, and even confuse and trick ourselves that, hey, it was just a no-win situation, everything was just pressing down on me. And so we often don't take ownership of emotional issues, of soul issues, as we do with physical, with relational, with intellectual, with other types of issues. And the truth is, in the same way that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, so also are we. We will not excel as people beyond our ability to be physically healthy and whole, mentally healthy and whole, emotionally, spiritually, relationally connected. Our whole parts are all important. Now, as it relates to this one from emotional quotient, I remember speaking to some of the men at Advance 10.0. And I was talking about soul wholeness for that brief moment. And I read some statistics to them that speak to why this emotional health part is super important. When I was reading the book Emotional Intelligence 2.0 a couple years ago, and this is on page 76 of the Soul Wholeness book, I came across these stats. People with the highest IQ levels, so highest intellectual levels, outperform those with average IQ only 20% of the time. You think the smartest person in the room is always going to excel the most, but what they're saying is no, that's not true. Average IQ people outperform high IQ people 70% of the time. It's interesting to me because typically when we grade people in school, we grade based on IQ, which is your ability to assess and assimilate new information. And they say your IQ, it's a relatively unchanging number. I mean, it may flex a little bit, but it doesn't radically grow over time is what they say. I don't know if I agree with that or not. When we ask people how they did on tests or how they did on their report card, we always look at IQ-related assessments. Yet here, the data shows that people with average IQ outperform high IQ people most of the time. They also studied to see who were high performers in their fields. 90% of high performers have high EQ, emotional quotient. 20% of low performers have high EQ. In other words, a greater predictor of success tends to be our ability to deal with hard stuff, to walk through in an emotionally healthy way. People with high EQ, emotional quotient, make more money too, an average of $29,000 more per year than people with low EQ across all trades. In fact, they gave this test in Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and in the test, every point that you make accounted for about a $1,300 uptick in salary across all fields. So the greater predictor of success, again, emotional quotient. In fact, this is a quote. It's the single biggest predictor of performance in the workplace and the strongest driver of leadership and personal excellence.